Jiwon walked slowly into the giant meeting hall where hundreds of alien creatures waited for her. The ceiling stretched so high above that she could barely see it, and the walls were made of some kind of glowing crystal that hurt her eyes if she looked too long. The other species in the room were massive compared to her small human frame. There were beings made of living rock that stood 3 times her height and floating gas clouds that sparkled with their own inner light. Some aliens looked like giant insects with too many arms, while others resembled walking trees with bark that moved like skin. She carried a small data pad in her hands that contained the peace treaty between Earth and the Vorthak Empire. The Vorthak delegate was a creature that looked like a cross between a lizard and a nightmare, with scales that shifted color when it was angry. Jiwon had spent 6 months learning how to speak their hissing language, and now she would sign another agreement that kept humans safe by promising they would never fight anyone. The Vorthak general made a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe, which meant he was laughing. He found it amusing that such a tiny creature could speak for an entire species. Jiwon smiled. Back at him, the same calm smile she always wore during these meetings. She had signed 47 peace treaties in the last 2 years, and each one made the galaxy a little safer for humanity. Captain Hyunwoo stood on the bridge of his ship, the Harmony, and watched the stars through the main viewing screen. His crew of 30 humans moved quietly around him, checking instruments and updating navigation charts. The ship was painted white with red medical symbols on its hull and carried no weapons of any kind. Instead, the cargo holds were filled with medicine, food supplies, and equipment for helping people who were hurt or lost. They had been traveling through space for 5 years now, visiting different worlds and helping anyone who needed it. When pirates attacked trading ships, Hyunwoo would arrive not to fight but to take care of the wounded and give food to families who had lost everything. The predator species in the galaxy found this behavior strange and amusing. Humans were clearly prey animals who had somehow learned to build spaceships but were too weak to use them for fighting. Lieutenant Minjin worked at the navigation station, planning their next route to deliver medical supplies to a refugee camp 3 systems away. He had joined the crew because he wanted to see the galaxy and help people, but sometimes he felt confused when he looked at the empty spaces on the ship's walls where weapon systems should have been installed. His grandfather had told him stories about old Earth wars, but those stories felt like fairy tales about a different species entirely. The Corvani Syndicate controlled 12 star systems with fleets of warships that could destroy planets. General Vex was a creature made of living shadow and pure hatred who commanded armies that had conquered hundreds of worlds. He spent his days planning new battles and expanding his empire across the galaxy. When his scouts reported human colonies in the outer regions, he barely listened to the reports. Humans were like the small cleaning birds that lived on his home planet, useful for picking up scraps and waste but completely harmless. They would run away at the first sign of real danger, so there was no point in wasting good ammunition on them. His war fleets had better things to do than chase around creatures who would surrender before the first shot was fired. Dr. Minho worked deep underground beneath New Seoul Station, in a laboratory that most humans believed was used for growing better vegetables and studying plant diseases. The facility had 50 levels below ground and required special clearance just to enter the elevator. The project he worked on was so secret that even the human government pretended it did not exist. For 20 years, he had been part of something called the Restraint Protocol. Every human born in the last 500 years carried tiny machines in their blood that were smaller than individual cells. These machines watched the brain and made sure certain thoughts never became too strong. They kept humans calm, peaceful, and unable to feel the kinds of emotions that led to violence. The technology had been created after the first human space colonies discovered something disturbing about what happened to people when they lived away from Earth. Without the familiar environment of their home planet, humans began to change in ways that frightened their leaders. Psychological studies showed patterns of behavior that reminded scientists of Earth's ancient history when humans had been something very different. Lieutenant Soman flew patrol routes along the border between human space and Corvani territory. Her ship was armed with communication equipment and medical supplies, but carried no weapons. She often wondered why the military called these flights patrols when they never patrolled for anything dangerous. Her job was to help lost travelers and report on space traffic, not to fight enemy ships, sometimes. When she looked at the empty weapon mounts on her ship, she felt a strange sadness that she could not explain. Her grandmother had been a soldier during Earth's last wars before humans went to space, but those stories seemed impossible now. Humans were peaceful creatures who solved problems by talking, not fighting. The historical records clearly showed that violence had always been rare among her people. The galaxy continued its ancient patterns of strong species conquering weak ones and advanced civilizations absorbing primitive ones. It was the natural order that had existed for millions of years. In this order, humans sat at the bottom, protected only because they were too small and weak to be worth destroying. They avoided conflict through clever diplomacy and by running away when things became dangerous. What the galaxy did not know was that humanity. Peaceful nature was not natural evolution, but the result of careful technological control. The restraint protocol had been designed to suppress the brain chemistry that had once made human warriors legendary for their refusal to surrender. It quieted the instincts that could turn ordinary people into unstoppable forces when their families were threatened. Most importantly, it blocked the peculiar human trait that other species would later learn to fear: the ability to choose mutual destruction rather than accept defeat. The machines in human blood prevented them from accessing the pack-hunting behaviors that had made their ancestors apex predators on Earth. They could not feel the battle rage that had once driven human soldiers to fight impossible odds and win through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The protocol had created a species of gardeners and poets. From what had once been the most dangerous predators their planet had ever produced, unknown to the warlike species that ruled the galaxy, humans had not evolved to be peaceful. They had been forced to become peaceful by their own technology. The difference would prove to be crucial when the galaxy faced its greatest threat. The Corvani Syndicate and other predator species measured their enemies by natural abilities, but humans had no natural abilities anymore. They had artificial limitations. That could be removed. Dr. Minho sometimes stood in his laboratory late at night looking at the emergency protocols that could shut down the restraint system. The authorization codes were split among 12 people across human space, and he was one of them. The shutdown procedure had been designed for only one situation: if humanity faced complete extinction and needed to remember what they had chosen to forget. As the galaxy spun through space in its familiar patterns of conquest and submission, none of the great powers suspected that the weakest species among them was actually sleeping. The humans who wrote poetry about distant stars and grew flowers in space stations were not what they appeared to be. They were predators wearing the mask of prey, and soon something would come that would force them to remember their true nature. The first signs that something was wrong came from the edge of known space, where reality itself seemed to bend and twist in ways that hurt to look at. Ships that traveled too close to the strange area came back with crews that could not stop talking about shapes that made no sense and colors that had no names. The thing that came out of this wound in space was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Scientists tried to give it a name and finally called it the Devourer. But it did not look like any form of life they knew. It ate not just planets and stars, but the very fabric of space and time itself, leaving behind areas of complete emptiness that made people sick just to think about. When the Devourer passed through a region, that space simply stopped existing, as if it had never been there at all. Captain Hyunwoo was delivering medicine to a refugee camp when the first distress call reached his ship. The message was broken and filled with screaming, but the location was clear. An entire star system had gone dark in less than 6 hours. When the Harmony arrived at the edge of where the system should have been, they found nothing. Not empty space filled with debris, but a perfect sphere of nothingness that seemed to drink light itself. The ship sensors could not understand what they were seeing. According to every instrument, the space in front of them simply did not exist at all. Hyunwoo had seen many strange things in his years exploring the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him. For the sight of reality with a hole cut out of it, his crew stood on the bridge staring at displays that showed impossible readings. Engineer Kiwon tried to scan the void sphere with every sensor the ship carried, but each attempt gave different results that contradicted each other. It was as if the laws of physics themselves were broken in that region. Some readings suggested the sphere contained infinite mass, while others indicated it had no mass at all. Temperature sensors showed both. Absolute zero and temperatures hotter than the core of a star. The Galactic Council called an emergency meeting as reports flooded in from across the outer rim of known space. Entire civilizations were disappearing overnight with no trace left behind. The Machonic Collective, who had mastered technology that could reshape matter at the atomic level, simply stopped responding to all communications. Their home system became another void sphere that hurt to observe. Ambassador Ji-won sat in the human section of the council chambers, watching alien representatives panic in ways she had never seen before. The crystal beings who normally communicated in beautiful musical tones were producing harsh, discordant sounds that spoke of terror beyond words. The gas creatures, who usually floated with graceful movements, were now pulsing erratically with colors that had no translation in any known language. The proud warrior species who had dominated the galaxy for millennia were admitting something that had never happened before. They were afraid. Not afraid of losing battles or territories, but afraid of facing an enemy that their greatest weapons could not even scratch. General Vex of the Corvani Syndicate sat in his command center watching. His most powerful fleets prepare for a battle they did not understand. His ships carried weapons that could crack planets and boil away atmospheres. Each vessel was crewed by warriors who had never known defeat in thousands of battles across hundreds of worlds. The quantum torpedoes in their arsenals could destroy entire moons, while their energy cannons could slice through neutronium like it was paper. But all of their experience was with enemies that followed the normal rules of physics, Dr. Minho worked day and night in his hidden laboratory as the reports grew worse with each passing hour. The Devourer was not just destroying civilizations, it was erasing them so completely that it became impossible to prove they had ever existed at all. The entity consumed history itself, leaving behind gaps in the galaxy collective memory that no one could explain. The emergency protocols for shutting down the restraint system had been designed for exactly this kind of situation, when humanity faced total extinction and conventional methods had failed. The authorization codes were locked in special devices that could only be opened by 12 specific people across human space, and Dr. Minho was one of them. His hands shook as he prepared. The equipment that could change humanity forever. Lieutenant Somin was traveling back toward Earth when she first noticed the changes happening to her crew. People were getting headaches that the medical scanner could not identify. The ship doctor reported strange brain activity that looked like old archived patterns from Earth military personnel before the space age. Dreams were becoming vivid and violent, featuring conflicts that none of them had ever experienced. Navigator Minjun reported that he was having trouble sleeping because of dreams about ancient battles on Earth where humans fought with primitive weapons against impossible odds. The dreams felt more real than his actual memories, and he could remember tactics and strategies that had never been part of his training. When he tried to access the historical databases to verify these memories, he found that many records from Earth early period were classified beyond his clearance level. The Devourer moved through the galaxy, like a plague of nothingness consuming everything in its path without seeming to follow any pattern or logic. Sometimes it would destroy heavily populated systems while ignoring empty regions of space. Other times it would erase single planets, while leaving the rest of their solar system untouched. The only constant was that everything it touched ceased to exist in any meaningful way. General Vex launched his first attack against the Devourer with a fleet of his most powerful warships. The battle lasted exactly 14 minutes and 47 seconds. The entity consumed every weapon fired at it as if the energy was food, making it grow larger and more complex with each attack. The few ships that escaped brought back recordings that would haunt military analysts for generations. The footage showed reality itself breaking down as the Devourer-fed space began folding in on itself, creating impossible geometries that caused madness in anyone who looked at them directly. The proud Corvani warriors who had conquered half the galaxy found their greatest weapons not just useless, but actually helping their enemy grow stronger. Lieutenant Somin felt the changes in herself as her patrol ship approached human space. The headaches that had plagued her for days suddenly intensified, then disappeared completely, leaving behind a clarity of thought she had never experienced. In that moment, she understood that something fundamental about humanity was changing, and that the peaceful species she had always known was not what they had originally been. The galaxy's greatest predators were learning a lesson about the nature of power. Sometimes the most dangerous creatures are not the ones who choose to fight, but the ones who choose not to fight until they have no other choice. The Devourer was approaching the core systems where Earth waited with its gardens and poetry, but something was stirring in human space that had been sleeping for 500 years, as the void spheres spread across the galaxy like an infection of nothingness. The peaceful humans began to remember what their ancestors had been capable of when the survival of their species was at stake. The storm was gathering, and soon the galaxy would learn that there were worse things than extinction. There was awakening. The defense of Nexus Prime became the galaxy's last desperate stand against the approaching darkness. Representatives from every surviving species brought their remaining fleets to form the largest military force in galactic history. Ships from 100 different worlds filled the space around the system that housed the Galactic Council headquarters' energy shields that could deflect the heat of dying stars, formed layer after layer of protection around the most important planet's captain. Hanwu brought the Harmony to join the massive defense fleet, though his ship carried no weapons to contribute to the fight. Instead, his cargo holds were packed with medical supplies, emergency food, and equipment for treating the wounded who would inevitably result from the coming battle. He watched from his bridge as military commanders from across the galaxy tried to coordinate a defense against an enemy that had never been defeated. The human contribution to the defense fleet was small. Perhaps 50 ships among the thousands that had gathered. Most of these were civilian vessels that had been pressed into service as hospital ships and supply runners. The other species barely noticed the humans among them. These peaceful creatures would help clean up after the real warriors had finished fighting the battle. Ambassador Jiwan worked without rest in the council chambers, helping different species communicate with each other during the crisis. Many of these races had been enemies for centuries, and their languages contained words that were insults in other cultures. The emergency had forced cooperation that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but Jiwan could see the strain in every delicate movement. The crystalline Vexari made sounds like breaking glass when they were afraid, while the gas creatures pulsed with colors that had no names in any solid species language. Even the proud Corvani were showing signs of stress as their perfect military discipline began to crack under the weight of facing an enemy they could not understand or fight using conventional methods. The Devourer approach was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed before. It did not arrive as a fleet of ships or even as a single massive entity. Instead, reality began to break down at the edges of the Nexus system. Stars started flickering in their positions as if they could not decide where they were supposed to be. Planets developed shadows that fell in directions that had no meaning in normal geometry. Dr. Minho stood in his laboratory communication center holding one of the 12 keys that could shut down the restraint protocol. Similar scenes were happening in hidden facilities across human space as his colleagues prepared to make the same terrible choice. The galaxy military leaders had made their position clear. Conventional weapons were completely useless against the Devourer, and nothing in their arsenals could even slow down its advance. The decision to deactivate the protocol was not made by any government or military command. It was made by 12 scientists who understood what humanity would become if the artificial limits on their behavior were removed. They had spent decades studying the psychological profiles of humans before the space age, and the data was clear. Without the protocol, humanity would remember what they had been before they chose to become peaceful. Lieutenant Somin felt the change beginning as her patrol ship moved toward the defense perimeter. The headaches that had affected her crew for days suddenly became much worse, then stopped completely, leaving behind a mental clarity that was almost painful in its intensity. She could think faster and see patterns in the tactical displays that had never been obvious before. Her crew was changing too. Engineer Do Hyun, who had spent years maintaining hydroponic gardens, was suddenly calculating weapons trajectories with mathematics he had never learned. Navigator Minjun was planning attack routes through asteroid fields using tactics that existed in no military manual. The transformation was happening to every human in the fleet as genetic memories suppressed for centuries began to surface. When the Devourer finally appeared at the edge of the Nexus system, it manifested as a sphere of darkness so complete that it seemed to exist in more dimensions than the normal universe could contain. The assembled defense fleets opened fire immediately, unleashing enough destructive power to destroy entire solar systems. Energy beams that could slice through neutronium struck the entity along with projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The result was exactly what had happened in every previous encounter. The Devourer absorbed every attack and grew larger, feeding on the energy that was supposed to destroy it. Weapons that could crack planets had no more effect than throwing pebbles at a black hole. The entity began expanding its influence through the system, creating new void spheres that consumed everything they touched. Captain Hyunwoo watched his sensors as the defense fleet began to collapse around them. Ship after ship disappeared into expanding areas of nothingness that spread like a disease through local space. The greatest warships ever built lasted no longer than small civilian transports when the void spheres reached them. Everything that entered those regions of absolute emptiness simply ceased to exist. Crystal formations of the Vexari, which had been grown over centuries and could channel the power of entire stars, crumbled into non-existence without slowing the entity advance. The Corvani battlecruisers, each one capable of destroying planets, found their armor and shields useless against an enemy that did not follow the rules of physics. Lieutenant Somin felt something change deep in her mind as the battle raged around them. The restraint protocol that had kept her thoughts calm and peaceful for her entire life suddenly shut down completely. In that moment, she remembered what humans had been capable of before they had chosen to limit themselves. Her ancestors had not survived on a world full of predators by being gentle and avoiding conflict. Dr. Minho activated the emergency shutdown sequence in his laboratory and watched as status lights across human space began changing from green to red. The restraint protocol was deactivating in the minds of millions of humans, simultaneously releasing genetic memories and behavioral patterns that had been suppressed for 500 years. The change was not just mental but physical as well. Stress hormones that had been artificially controlled began flowing freely through human bloodstreams, triggering enhanced reaction times and increased pain tolerance. Neural pathways associated with violence and tactical thinking came online after decades of being dormant. Most importantly, the social bonding mechanisms that made humans effective pack hunters began to activate on a species-wide scale. Captain Hyunwoo felt the transformation as his crew began moving with a coordination they had never displayed before. Technician Kiwon, who had spent years calibrating medical equipment, was suddenly converting healing devices into weapon systems that should not have been possible to create. Engineer Do-Yun, whose expertise was in growing vegetables, found himself calculating how to turn the ship's fusion reactor into an improvised bomb. The Harmony was becoming something it had never been designed to be, as its crew stripped power conduits from medical bay equipment to create weapons that existed in no technical manual. The ship that had spent 5 years delivering medicine and food to refugees was being transformed into an instrument of war by people who were remembering what their species had once been capable of. Ambassador Ji-won felt the change in herself as well. The diplomatic training that had taught her to find peaceful solutions to every conflict was being overwhelmed by older instincts that whispered of last stands and final measures. The gentle smile that she had worn during countless treaty negotiations was replaced by an expression that would have made the galaxy's most feared warriors uncomfortable. As the defense fleet collapsed around them and the Devourer continued its advance through the system, the human ships began moving in patterns that confused every military observer. They were no longer retreating or seeking cover. Instead, they were moving toward the entity with a sense of purpose that made no logical sense for such a weak species. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who have spent the longest time pretending to be prey. The transformation began in Lieutenant Somin's mind with a single thought that cut through 500 years of artificial conditioning like a knife through paper. Something had threatened her crew, and that was not acceptable. Her ancestors had not crawled out of caves and survived ice ages by being gentle creatures who avoided conflict. They had been the apex predators of their world, and somewhere deep in her genetic memory, those instincts were waking up. Captain Hyunwoo felt the change, as his ship crew started working together in ways that seemed impossible. People who had never trained for combat were moving like veteran soldiers who had fought together for years. Technician Kiwon was converting medical scanners into targeting systems, while Engineer Do-Yun calculated how to turn their fusion reactor into a weapon that could crack asteroids. The Harmony was being transformed from a peaceful medical ship into something that had never existed before. Its white hull with red medical crosses was being stripped and rebuilt as the crew worked with desperate efficiency to create weapons from healing equipment. The irony was not lost on Hyunwoo that they were destroying everything that had made their ship a symbol of peace in order to save peace itself. Across human space, similar transformations were happening on thousands of ships as the restraint protocol shut down in millions of minds simultaneously. Humans who had spent their entire lives growing gardens and writing poetry were remembering that their species had once been the most dangerous hunters their planet had ever produced. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. Dr. Minho monitored the changes from his laboratory as human brain patterns shifted across the galaxy. The alterations were not just psychological, but biological as well. Hormones that had been suppressed for centuries began flowing freely through human bloodstreams. The fight-or-flight response that had been artificially dampened was returning with interest as 500 years of stored instincts activated at once. Lieutenant Somin found herself planning attack patterns using knowledge she had never learned. Her patrol ship was being modified by her crew into something that resembled a weapon. More than a vehicle, Do-Hyun was installing improvised missile launchers made from emergency flare systems, while navigator Min-jun calculated intercept courses that would bring them into direct contact with void spheres. The strangest part was how natural it all felt. The tactical knowledge flowing through her mind seemed more familiar than the peaceful thoughts that had guided her for 25 years. She understood now that humanity had been wearing a mask for centuries, pretending to be something they were not. The galaxy had believed the disguise so completely that even humans had forgotten what lay beneath it. Ambassador Jiwan stood in the council chambers watching Alien. Delegates react with confusion and growing alarm as reports came in about the human fleet behavior. The peaceful species that had signed every treaty offered was suddenly moving toward the Devourer with apparent suicide intentions. Ships that had never carried weapons were somehow creating them from medical equipment and scientific instruments. The crystalline Vexari began producing sounds like wind chimes in a hurricane as they tried to understand what they were witnessing. The gas creatures pulsed with colors that had no translation, but clearly meant something like terrified bewilderment. Even General Vex of the Corvani Syndicate was watching the tactical displays with an expression that resembled concern for the first time in his. Military career Captain Hyunwoo communication system crackled with voices from other human ships, and he realized that they were all thinking the same thoughts without any central coordination. It was as if the entire species had suddenly remembered how to hunt as a pack. The coordination was not coming from military training, but from genetic memory that reached back to when humans had been persistence. Hunters on African plains, the first human ship to engage the Devourer directly was a civilian. Transport called the New Busan, carrying refugees from an outer rim colony. Captain Yoongi had received orders to evacuate the combat zone, but instead he turned his vessel toward the nearest void sphere and began accelerating. His ship had no weapons, but it did have a fusion reactor and several thousand tons of metal that could be turned into the galaxy's largest bullet. The explosion when the New Busan struck the void sphere actually caused the area of nothingness to contract for the first time since the entity had appeared. The effect lasted only seconds, but it proved that the Devourer could be hurt if someone was willing to pay the right price. Yoongi's sacrifice sent a message through the human fleet that was understood without words. Doctor. Minho watched the neural patterns spreading across human space as the transformation accelerated. The changes were not just affecting individual minds, but creating connections between them. Pack hunting behavior required coordination, and humans were developing it naturally as their suppressed instincts awakened. Social bonding mechanisms that had been dormant for centuries were forming links between ships separated by light years. Lieutenant Somin felt the connection form in her mind like a new sense awakening. She could feel the presence of other human ships across the battlefield and understand their intentions without radio communication. Her patrol vessel moved into formation with vessels she had never seen before following. Patterns that seemed to be written in her genetic code. The coordination was beautiful and terrifying to watch from outside. Human ships began moving in spirals and formations that resembled predator behavior more than military tactics. They were not following any battle plan created by strategists, but implementing hunting patterns that had been developed over millions of years of evolution. Engineer Do Yun completed his modifications to the Harmony engines, allowing the medical ship to accelerate far beyond its design limits. The price would be a complete reactor meltdown within hours, but that was acceptable because none of them expected to survive that long. The goal was not to win a traditional battle, but to hurt the enemy, badly enough that it would remember humans long after their species was extinct. Captain Hyunwoo stood on his bridge and looked around at his crew as they prepared for what would likely be their final mission. These people who had spent years delivering medicine and food to refugee camps were now working with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for a battle they knew they could not survive. The most disturbing change was in their expressions. The gentle smiles and calm demeanor that had characterized humans for centuries had been replaced by something that would have made the galaxy's most feared warriors step backward in alarm. They were still the same people, but something fundamental had shifted in their nature. Lieutenant Somin checked her ship systems one final time as they approached the Devourer main concentration. Her vessel was now more weapon than ship-carrying improvised explosives that would have been impossible to create without detailed knowledge of both medicine and destruction. The fact that humans excelled at both healing and killing was not a contradiction, but a feature. The alien observers in the remaining defense fleet watched with fascination and growing unease as the human ships implemented tactics that made no logical sense. Medical vessels were being converted into guided missiles. Scientific equipment was being turned into weapons that violated several laws of physics. Most disturbing of all, the humans had begun to smile in ways that suggested they were looking forward to what was about to happen. Ambassador Jiwan felt the change in herself as the diplomatic conditioning that had guided her career was overwhelmed by instincts that were far older. The smile she wore now was not the carefully practiced expression of a professional negotiator, but something that would have been recognized by any predator as a threat display. The galaxy was about to learn that there was a difference between a species that had evolved to be peaceful and a species that had chosen to restrain itself. The humans approaching the Devourer were not the gentle gardeners and poets that everyone had known for centuries. They were something much older and infinitely more dangerous that had been sleeping behind. A mask of artificial tranquility. Soon the mask would come off completely, and the universe would remember why Earth had once been the most dangerous planet in known space. The human fleet's final approach toward the Devourer Core looked like nothing the galaxy had ever seen before. 200 ships that had once been peaceful medical vessels and civilian transports now moved in patterns that resembled a pack of wolves. Surrounding their prey, each ship trailed modified reactor exhaust that left geometric patterns in space, creating what could only be described as a war dance written in fusion fire and desperate determination. Captain Hunwoo's voice cut through the static-filled communications as he coordinated the attack. His words carried an authority that had nothing to do with military rank and everything to do with the species-wide awakening that had transformed humanity. Every human ship knew its role in what was coming, not because they had been given orders, but because the plan existed in their shared genetic memory like an ancient song. The first wave consisted of the smallest vessels, patrol ships, and personal transports that had been converted into guided missiles. Lieutenant Soman led this group, her ship hull packed with every explosive device her crew could create from medical equipment and emergency supplies. As they accelerated toward the nearest void sphere, she felt a savage joy that centuries of conditioning had never allowed her to experience. This was what her species had been designed for, not the careful tending of gardens in space, but the wild charge into impossible odds with nothing but improvised weapons and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The feeling was intoxicating, like waking up from a dream that had lasted her entire life. Her patrol ship had become a spear, aimed at the heart of something that thought itself invincible. The explosions that followed actually pushed back the boundaries of non-existence for the first time since the Devourer had emerged. Void spheres that had consumed entire fleets contracted as human ships detonated in carefully calculated patterns. The entity response was immediate and terrible as reality began unraveling faster, but the humans had expected this. They had planned for it. They had weaponized it. Dr. Minho watched from his laboratory as his calculations proved correct. The Devourer was not truly destroying matter and energy, but converting them into something else, something that existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. But the conversion process had limits and overflow points where the entity had to discharge excess energy back into regular space. Lieutenant Salmon's ship struck the void sphere at 90% of light speed and simply ceased to exist, but her sacrifice created a weak point that rippled through the Devourer multidimensional structure. As her consciousness faded into nothingness, she felt a fierce satisfaction knowing that her death had meaning, that she had hurt something that had never been hurt before. The second wave of attacks came from medium-sized vessels that had been converted into exotic matter launchers. Captain Deho commanding. A former colony ship fired projectiles made from compressed space, time-itself weapons that should have been impossible to create, but which human engineers had improvised using principles that violated everything they thought they knew about physics. The projectiles struck the void spheres and disappeared, but their absence created ripple effects that spread through the entity like cracks in glass. Captain Deho watched his ship instruments overload as the exotic matter discharge feedback fried every system on his vessel, but he was already dead from radiation exposure, so it no longer mattered. Ambassador G1 coordinated the final phase from the council chambers, though her role had changed from diplomat to strategist. The alien delegates watched in horror and amazement as she outlined the human battle plan, a strategy that required not just the sacrifice of their entire fleet, but the deliberate triggering of a space-time cascade that would either destroy the Devourer or make the entire region uninhabitable for millions of years. The largest human ships formed the final assault wave. These vessels carried the most dangerous cargo of all artificial black holes created by converting their own mass using modified fusion reactors. Captain Hyunwoo Harmony led this group, its medical bays now containing gravitational weapons that pulsed with barely contained space-time distortions. As they approached the Devourer central mass, reality began breaking down around them in ways that caused physical pain just to observe. The entity seemed to recognize the threat posed by these larger vessels, and void spheres began manifesting directly in their path, trying to consume the ships before they could deliver their impossible payload. But humans had one final advantage that no other species possessed: the ability to continue functioning. When everything rational said they should give up, ship after ship disappeared into nothingness, but their crews kept fighting even as existence itself dissolved around them. They had become something beyond normal biology, something that could choose to fight, when fighting meant certain death. Engineer Do-hyun completed his final modifications to the Harmony reactor as void spheres closed. In around them, the medical ship that had spent years saving lives was about to become the most destructive weapon ever created by human hands. The irony was perfect, in a way that would have made him laugh if he had still been capable of such gentle emotions. Lieutenant Commander Minjun took over navigation as Captain Hyunwoo prepared for the final run. His instruments showed impossible readings as the Devourer influence warped space around them, but he had stopped trusting instruments and started trusting instincts that reached back to when humans hunted mammoth with pointed sticks. The entity seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in its human prey. The void spheres began expanding faster, trying to consume them before they could complete whatever transformation was occurring. But it was already too late. The peaceful gardeners and poets of human space had remembered what they were capable of when everything they loved was threatened. Captain Hyunwoo's ship was among the last to be consumed, but not before he triggered the artificial black hole in his cargo bay. The gravitational anomaly began eating the Devourer from within, creating a feedback loop that the entity could not process or escape. The cosmic scream that followed was felt across multiple dimensions as reality itself protested against what was happening. The Devourer death throes lasted 17 minutes and 42 seconds as it imploded into a point of absolute density that even it could not consume. Space-time began healing around the wound like flesh growing over a cut, but the scars would remain for eons as a reminder of what had happened when humanity chose to stop pretending to be harmless. In the end, nothing remained of the human fleet but expanding clouds of particles and the fading radiation signatures of weapons that should never have existed. But their sacrifice had saved not just the galaxy, but the concept of existence itself. The Devourer was gone, and would never threaten anyone again. The alien survivors floating in the void around Nexus Prime tried to process what they had witnessed. The peaceful species that had signed every treaty and avoided every conflict had just saved the universe by becoming something so terrible that it could fight a cosmic horror on equal terms. They had always known humans as gentle creatures who wrote poetry about distant stars. Now they would remember them as the species that had chosen to become monsters in order to protect everything they held dear. The galaxy would never make the mistake of underestimating the quiet ones again. The silence that followed the Devourer's destruction was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced. Where the entity had existed, space-time itself seemed to be healing, reality slowly reasserting its familiar laws and geometries. The few surviving alien ships hung motionless in the void, their crews trying to process what they had just witnessed. Of the human fleet, nothing remained but expanding clouds of particles and the fading radiation signatures of their impossible weapons. Ambassador Ji-won stood before the assembled representatives of the Galactic Council 3 days after the battle. Her appearance subtly but fundamentally changed. Where once she had moved with the careful grace of a professional diplomat, she now carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to fight rather than flee. Her species had saved the galaxy, but the cost had been the peaceful nature that had defined humanity for millennia. Dr. Minho's laboratory had been sealed and classified at the highest levels of human government. The technology that had created the restraint protocol still existed, but the decision had been made at the species level. Never again would humanity allow itself to forget what it was capable of when cornered. The galaxy had learned to fear the humans who wrote poetry and tended gardens. How much more would they fear the humans who remembered how to wage war? The reconstruction efforts began immediately, but the political landscape of the galaxy had shifted permanently. Species that had dismissed humanity as harmless prey now requested formal defense treaties. The Corvani Syndicate, whose fleets had been decimated in the first days of the Devour crisis, offered to share their military technology with human engineers. The crystalline Vexari, masters of energy manipulation, sought to establish joint research programs with the species that had somehow weaponized medical equipment and garden tools. Captain Yuna, one of the few human ship commanders to survive. The final battle found herself appointed as the first human admiral in galactic history. Her vessel, a former agricultural transport that had been heavily modified during the crisis, became the flagship of humanity's first official military fleet. The irony was not lost on her that humans were now being invited to join conflicts they had previously avoided not as peacekeepers, but as warriors whose tactical unpredictability had become legendary. The memorial for the lost human crews covered an entire moon, but it was unlike any war memorial ever constructed. Instead of honoring glorious victory or noble sacrifice, it commemorated the moment when an entire species chose to abandon everything they had become in order to protect everything they loved. The names of the dead were inscribed not in stone, but in modified space-time, creating gravitational patterns that would persist until the heat death of the universe. Lieutenant Commander Somin's sister, Min Seo, stood before one such inscription, reading the names of crew members who had transformed a medical patrol ship into a weapon of impossible destruction. She wore the uniform of the new Human Defense Corps, an organization that officially did not exist, but which every species in the galaxy knew was preparing for the next crisis. Because there would be a next crisis. There always was. And now the galaxy knew that humanity would not face it with garden tools and poetry. The Devourer had been destroyed, but its emergence had revealed cracks in the universe itself, places where reality was thin and other entities might eventually break through. Humanity's role in the galaxy had changed forever. They were no longer the harmless neighbors who avoided conflict and mediated disputes. They had become something far more dangerous, the species that others called when the universe itself needed protection. Dr. Minho's final report, classified, beyond the reach of most human officials, contained a single recommendation that would guide humanity's future. The restraint protocol was created to make us peaceful. Its destruction has made us free. We must never again allow ourselves to forget the price of that freedom or the reasons why we chose to pay it. The galaxy spun on in its ancient patterns, but now those patterns included a new constant: the knowledge that somewhere among the peaceful gardeners and gentle explorers of human space, weapons waited in the hands of a species that had proven they would sacrifice everything, including their own nature, to protect what they held dear. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was a universe that would never again make the mistake of assuming that the quiet ones were harmless.